Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second Sunan Ampel International Conference of Political and Social Sciences, SAICoPSS 2022. It is a great honor for me, Ummu, to be the master of ceremony today to welcome every one of you in this event. Before we proceed our program, we would like to thank everybody who has supported this conference to be held. Several honorable mentions, especially to the Dean of the Faculty of Social and Political Sciences, State Islamic University of Sunan Ampel, Surabaya, Professor Ahmad Muzaki, M.Ag, Graduate C, M.Phil, PhD, the Vice Dean of Academic and Institutional Affairs, Dr. Abdul Khalik, M.Ag, the Vice Dean of General Administration, Planning and Finance Affairs, Professor Dr. Hajjah Wiwi Setiani, M.Ag, the Vice Dean of Cooperation and Student Affairs, Dr. Habib Mustafa, MSE, the Head of Department and Secretary, and to all lecturers, managerial staff, and participants. Ladies and gentlemen, we would like to welcome and greetings our invited speakers, Dr. Ian Wilson from Murdoch University, Australia, Dr. Zainal Abidin Bagir from ICRS Universitas Gadjah Mada, Indonesia, Dr. Beben Benyamin from University of South Australia, and Dr. Ummu Atiyah Ahmad Zakwan from Universiti Utara, Malaysia. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, for a moment, let us express our gratitude to Almighty God, Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, for His grace and guidance to us, so that today, on the 12th April 2022, we are capable of organizing this event, the second Sunan Ampel International Conference of Political and Social Sciences, SAICoPSS 2022, with the theme Post-Pandemic Recovery, Embracing Social and Political Changes, Reviving Religious Practices. May peace and blessings of Almighty God be upon Prophet Muhammad SAW, along with his family and companions, and may Allah guide us to follow their path and way of life. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, to make this event run smoothly with the blessings from Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, let us open this event by reading Ummul Quran together. Ala hadiniya wa bikullin niyatun salihah. Al-Fatiha. Amin, amin, ya Rabbal Alamin. Ladies and gentlemen, as a sense of love for our country and campus, State Islamic University Sunan Ampel, Surabaya, let us sing the national anthem, Indonesia Raya, followed with the hymn song of UINSA. Ladies and gentlemen, please sit up straight.
Song, merah putih. Hormat! Halt!
Thank you. Dear Excellencies, distinguished guests, and participants, our next agenda is welcoming speech from the Dean of the Faculty of Social and Political Sciences of the State Islamic University of Sunan Ampel, Surabaya, Professor Ahmad Muzaki, Graduate M.Phil PhD. The time is yours.
Okay. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, everybody, for those who live in Indonesia, and good afternoon for our colleagues, speakers from Australia and also from around the world. Welcome to the second Sunan Ampel International Conference on Political and Social Sciences. This is an annual conference to deal with the current phenomena dealing with the social and political sciences held by the Faculty of Political and Social Science of the State Islamic University of Sunan Ampel, Surabaya. On behalf of the Dean of the Faculty, I would like to thank our speakers and also participants who really actively engage with the activities during the preparation step, and also today and also tomorrow for the conference, for today international conference. And also I would like to thank all the committees, Mbak Umi, Master of Ceremony, and also Mbak Ajeng, and all the committees really in charge of the international conference. Thanks, everybody. Welcome to the second Sunan Ampel International Conference of Political and Social Science 2022. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, sir. Okay, next, let us watch a short clip about last year's event, SAICoPSS 2021.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the plenary session of Day 2.
Leaders use the Ahmadiyya method.
Dr. Father is not doing so well. Thank you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we arrive at the main event, the plenary session with our invited speaker of day 1, Dr. Beben Benyamin from University of South Australia and Dr. Ian Wilson from Murdoch University, Australia, with our moderator today, Mr. Luthfi Hidayatullah, M.Hub.Int, the lecturer in the Department of International Relations, Faculty of Social and Political Science, UINSA, as our moderator. Let us give the time and place to the moderator to conduct the plenary session. The time is yours.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Bismillah walhamdulillah wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Good morning everyone and welcome to the first plenary session of the second Sunan Ampel International Conference of Political and Social Sciences SAICoPSS 2022. My name is Luthfi and I will be the moderator of today's plenary session. On this plenary session, we will have two speakers speaking as the presenters of today's event. The first one is Professor Beben Benyamin, PhD. He is a group leader at the Australian Centre for Precision Health, the University of South Australia. And the second speaker will be Dr. Ian Wilson. He is a senior lecturer in the Global Security Program in the School of Arts, Business, Law, and Social Sciences, Murdoch University, Australia. I will read out the rules of this plenary session. Each speaker will be given approximately 1 hour, which is 60 minutes, to present or to deliver his presentation. So Professor Beben Benyamin will be the first presenter, and after that, Dr. Ian Wilson will be the second presenter. After both of the speakers have completed their presentation, we will proceed to the question and answer session. During the question and answer session, after both of the speakers have completed their presentations, please use our raise hand feature before asking the question. So our host will turn on your microphone if you would like to ask a question directly to one of our speakers or both of our speakers. The other option is by typing your question on the chat box, and as the moderator, I will read out the question to one of our speakers or both of our speakers. If you would like to ask a question, please don't forget to mention your name and your institution of origin and to which speaker are you asking the question to. So without further ado, let us begin the plenary session by welcoming our first speaker, Professor Beben Benyamin, PhD. The time and screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Pak Luthfi. Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Morning. So I would like to thank the organizer to invite me to this wonderful conference. And then I would like also to thank my colleague, my dear friend, Professor Ahmad Zaki, who personally invited me to this conference. So thank you. So I'm going to share screen now. So, okay, share screen. So when Professor Zaki invited me to this conference, I was a bit unsure what topic to kind of discuss, because the conference is kind of outside my area of expertise. But then I have been teaching public health for the last 5 years or so at the UniSA, and then also I have been following the update about the COVID-19 situation in Australia and Indonesia, and I also have written some kind of opinion in some of the Indonesian newspaper about the COVID-19, and then also work with a lot of colleagues in Indonesia, scientists in Indonesia, and activists who kind of provide educational material for COVID-19 pandemic for the last 2 years. So I thought that probably this topic will be useful, because it's everyone has concern about COVID-19, although I think people will get bored about this, but I think this is a good idea. So what I'm going to do is to give an update of the current situation worldwide, especially in Australia and Indonesia, and then make some kind of conclusion of what kind of outlook of this pandemic in the future. So before that, so I'm going to kind of bring back you for to the last 2 years about COVID-19, the emergent of the variant, the timeline, and the worldwide impact of this pandemic on the cases and mortality, which is not on the social science aspect, but on the public health aspect as my expertise, and the vaccination coverage, and then briefly compare between Australia and Indonesia situation, and then some outlook. Okay, so the virus that has been with us for the last 2 years is one of the type of virus called coronavirus. So SARS-CoV-2, that's the name of the virus that affecting COVID-19. So that's not the only coronavirus that has affected human. So it is RNA virus. It's very tiny RNA particle, which has so why it's called corona, because it has a crown, which is here. This is my pointer. So you can see here that the crown, it has a crown here, and then a spike protein. And then the other kind of relative of SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19 disease is SARS, which happened in China in 2003, and then also MERS-CoV, which occurred in Saudi Arabia 10 years ago. So SARS-CoV-2 is the one that widely spread across the world because of the infectiousness, highly transmittable disease. So this virus commonly affects the respiratory system, but also it can affect other organs as well. Yeah? So that's the virus. So with all other infectious disease, we know that because it can spread between one person to the other, so it's become a chain of transmission. Some even where there are a lot of people attended in a crowded space can have a super spreader effect, where, for example, one of the largest transmission or super spreader effect, or even is in Newcastle in Australia, where from one infected person there are about 200 infected person in one place in a nightclub also. But for other, so for outdoor setting, usually it's not really that infectious for most of the time. So to understand how disease spread, so we need to understand one of the key parameters in understanding infectious disease, which is reproductive number. So this is kind of a number that summarizes how many people will get infected from one infected person. Okay, so if I'm infected by virus, how many will I infect on average? Okay, so it's on average population. So initially, the Wuhan strain, okay, the variant of Wuhan, the original strain that affect China, has an R0 or reproductive number about 3, yeah, 2 between 2 to 3. So it means that one person can infect 3, and then for the next one, that 3% can infect 9%, and then so on. Okay, so it means you can see here in the middle here. So it's within 3 generations, it can infect 40. Okay, but flu is only infect about 1/8%. So it's after 3 generations, it's only infect 7. So difference is the number, although it's different by a small number, but the effect can be huge. So the most infectious disease that we know so far is measles. On the right corner here. So this is a measles, or in Indonesian is called campak or cacar. Yeah. So it has an R0 number or reproductive number about 15. So it's 1% can infect 15, and that 15 can infect another 15. So huge number. So this number, assuming that there is no vaccination and then there is no immunity from previous infection. So it means that if everyone is susceptible. So then we know that all coronavirus mutated. So it means that change some of the RNA sequence. So it means some of them extinct, but some of them becoming more transmissible, and then can be more deadly as well. For example, the Delta variant that affect badly India and Indonesia and some other country in the middle last year, where tens of thousands of people died because of the coronavirus, is called Delta variant. But we know that now, I think from the last year, we have Omicron. Omicron, which is more transmissible, and then similar lethality or deadly with the original strain. But because of the population has been mostly infected, or so it means that it has some immunity, and then also the vaccination has been successful, widespread. So it means that although a lot of cases reported, but it does not translate into higher mortality like Delta, where the vaccine has not been available for long. So it's Omicron B1 and then now Omicron B2, and then I read a report this morning that now there are also Omicron BA4, 3 and 4. So it's this virus does not stop mutating. Yeah? So it still continues to mutate, but probably the attention, it does not get much attention as people as before. So we can see here the trajectory of different variants. So we have the original Wuhan variant 614D, and then it was replaced by much more transmissible variant, Alpha, Beta, Gamma, and then the worst one, I think in terms of the mortality, was Delta. And then yet the worst one in terms of the number of cases and infection is Omicron, which is now spreading worldwide, including Europe several months ago, and then still infecting Australia at the moment as well. So when understanding infectious disease, there are three factors that we need to consider. So we call it as an epidemiological triad or triangle. The first triangle here is the agent or the virus itself. So it doesn't need to be virus, but for other infectious disease can be bacteria, or agent can be mosquito for malaria or dengue, for example. So the characteristic of virus or agent include how is it easy for people to become infected by this virus, how ill a person become, or how deadly it is, and then how is it spread. Okay, so this is some of the characteristic of the agent of the virus. The second one is environment where we live in. So whether the temperature, for example, that between season, yeah, like winter season usually associated with higher transmission of respiratory disease, and then population density and population behavior as well. That's one of the environmental factors. The factor that I'm interested in my research is on the host or the person itself. So, for example, we know that the chance of getting infected are probably similar between person, but we know that it's not the same. But once people get infected, we know that some people doesn't feel anything, and then some people require hospitalization, and small minority of people die. Okay, so these differences can be due to age, for example, sex, social class, income, education, and comorbidity with other disease. And then one of my research interests is on the genetics. So it's where the individual differences affect how individuals respond to infection. So this is an earlier figure from the original strain figure. So it's mean that so for the majority of people, we'll have a mild case or no symptom, like about 80%, and then probably large majority will not be detected or diagnosed, okay, because they don't get tested. And then 14% will develop severe disease that require hospitalization, and then 5% will require ICU, and then also some ventilation, and then unfortunately about 2%, 2 to 3% of the COVID infection died. Yeah, that's before vaccination. So this risk factor of COVID severity is highly related to age. Okay, so it means that older people are most likely to get severe effect or death by COVID compared to younger people. You can see here, for example, death here. Yeah, so for people who are between 40 to 49 years old, they are 10 times more likely to be dying because of COVID compared to people who are between 18 to 29. Okay, assuming that all comorbidity and other situations are the same. Okay, so even like for people who are more than 65 years old, it's 100 times more likely to die of infection because of COVID-19. So that's why I think when we in the early stage of pandemic, where the vaccination just started, and then the supply is still very limited, the government put a priority on who need to be vaccinated first based on the risk of individual of hospitalization or dying because of COVID-19. So it means that older people who have comorbidity, and then a frontline health worker, they are all among the priority group that need to be vaccinated first in the early pandemic, early vaccination. So the other condition that affect severity of COVID-19 is comorbidity with other disease. For example, obesity, hypertension, they are 3 times more likely to be hospitalized because of COVID, chronic kidney disease, and other conditions. So if you have more condition, even like for people who has 3 or more of this condition, they are 5 times more likely to be in hospital because of COVID compared to people who are similar age or similar demographic. So how about the individual genetic differences? This is the area of my research interest. So we know that people differ in their susceptibility to COVID-19 when once they get infected, but is a difference is only due to age or comorbidity or a social factor, but I'm interested in a genetic factor. So we know that there are a number of genes that has been associated with how easy people to get infected, and once get infected, how bad the outcome will be. But it's the prediction is still quite long, so it means it's not deterministic, but it's probabilistic. Yeah. So these are some of the genes that has been reviewed using data from 100,000 of cases and million of control, and then so there are a number of genes, including gene that determine blood group, ABO group, where increase the susceptibility to COVID-19, and then also ACE2. This is the receptor where the COVID virus bind to the body. That's increase the susceptibility of infection as well. And then the red one here is increase the mortality or severity of disease. So this has just been summarized yesterday. So what were, I think, probably, or what are probably, because some of the country still dealing with the pandemic, what are the main goal of public health measures to control infectious disease? So initially, I think in the early stage of the pandemic, one of the main effort is to eradicate the disease globally. So it means that scientists has been successful to eradicate SARS. Okay, so the one that happened like 20 years ago, but not for COVID-19. It has been much transmissible, so that it is very, very difficult to contain. Yeah? So I don't think the eradication of a disease of COVID-19 is feasible for COVID-19 given the transmission. So the next stage, if the eradication is not possible, how about eliminating the disease? So eliminating the disease is mean that removing the disease from a country or from region. So I think initially when the Alpha, Delta, and the original strain circulating, countries such as Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand, Vietnam is trying to eliminate the disease by do a lot of restriction within the country and then also closing the border. Okay, so it means, and then they try to get rid the elimination status of this. I mean, we were successful for the last 2 years on almost eliminating this. I think probably it's eliminated in some states, for example, South Australia, Western Australia, successful, but it's only for some time before the Omicron arrived, which much more transmissible. It means, and then also at the time population has already been vaccinated, so it means that the risk of getting infected and then getting hospitalized and disease becoming much lower than before. And we know in China, I think they are still trying to eliminate the disease within the country, and now I think there are lockdown in large number of a big city across China, because I think that's probably still one of the strategy that they want to do. But how much does this will cost them in terms of I mean social, economic, and other diseases as well. So I think most of the effort of by country, including Indonesia in the early pandemic, was to flatten the curve, is manage the outbreak so it doesn't overwhelm the public health system. So it's with some restriction, masking, and then testing. But it's still, I think, when Delta struck Indonesia last year, it still overwhelmed the public health system. And then now I think the idea is just to vaccinate the population. So it means that it, because we know that the vaccine can reduce the hospitalization and mortality. I think that seems that the approach that most countries take at the moment. I think how to control the spread of disease. So initially, I mean, this the idea is to reduce the R or reproductive number from 3, 5, or 6 into smaller than 1. Okay, so it means if it is smaller than 1, it means that it's only one person infected. It's maximum. It's only infected other person or doesn't affect any other person. So it means disease becoming not really widespread in the population. So there's formula which is TCDS. So it's all T is transmission. We use to reduce the so it's not only one or the other, but it needs to be done all of them. I mean, to reduce the disease. So it's will have the biggest effect when we all of them. Transmission basically to reduce the whole disease transmit between people using face masks, hand washing. To reduce C is to reduce the contact by isolating patient and physical distancing, for example. That's what some country, most country did or are still doing. And then reduce the duration of infection by treating the patient with, now we have a couple of good medication, Paxlovid and other. And then also S is to reduce the susceptible person by vaccination. That's provide immunity to person. So it's all this component need to be taken into account. Okay, so TCDS, reduce transmission, reduce contact, reduce the duration, and reduce the number of susceptible person. So that's the core idea of managing the spread of infectious disease. So how is kind of a different question and different between a period of COVID-19. So since 2 years ago, we can see that the main question that scientists are considering are different between the stage of pandemic. Yeah? So in the early days, question are, can this virus be contained does this virus has a potential pandemic? And then the answer that first answer is probably yes, or the other one is yes. And then what is a non-pharmaceutical intervention that most effective, whether it's masking, whether it is social distancing, and then what is kind of dominant of transmission, whether it's aerosol or fomite or other. And then another question is the virus mutating? Okay, and then whether people can be infected twice. And then as we continue to adapt with the vaccination, and then the question is how effective are the vaccine, and then how we deal with this Omicron. So it is evolving question throughout the pandemic. We can see here that the case is not decreasing; the cases still keep increasing. So here that since January, the worldwide case is almost like 4 times the wave in last year. Yeah? So what is the current figure at the moment? So this is, I got it from our World in Data, which is providing a very good resources on all related data, including COVID-19. So we know now that in total about 500 million reported case. So it means people who has been tested and positive for COVID-19. Why I call it as reported? Because it's not all cases are reported because of not doing enough testing, or people does not want to be tested. So it's about 500 million people in the world has been tested positive for COVID-19. You can see here the peak is in around March here in the world. See? And then Australian peak is also around March here. So that's the number of reported case. And then you can see here that, so I'm just making a comparison between India, Indonesia, United States, and Australia. Okay, so the green one is the total world population. Yeah. So it means that the peak of infection, about 3 million per day, is around a March. And then in Australia, that is here about February, January, February. And the peak wave is still second wave of Omicron now, I think, in Australia. And then in the United States here, it's big peak as well here. And in Indonesia, it's I think Indonesia has 2 main peak here in June, which is similar in India. Yeah. So in terms of the number of death, okay, so 6 million people has been reported dead, but this is the one that's been tested. So excess of death is people estimated to be 4 to 5 or even 10 times than this number. So while the infection keep increasing, but the death is quite stabilizing here, because we know that we have been well vaccinated, I think, all over the world. So this is because of the effect of vaccination, and then also effect of previous immunity from infection. But what I noticed here that Australia for the last 2 years until probably the end of last year has been managing the virus very well. So it's almost a very small number of deaths. But now here you can see here that in Australia, the number of death is, so this is not based on the per population. So this is probably a better comparison. So the number of new cases between Australia, India, and Indonesia per million people. Okay, so it's make it comparable, because we know that India has 1.5 billion people, Indonesia has 250 million people, and Australia only like 25 million. So it means that the absolute number are not comparable. But if we divide it by 1 million people, so it's becoming comparable. So in fact, in terms of the number of infection, Australia is much higher per million people since December last year, because Omicron compared to India and Indonesia. So Australia is the black one here, and then this is India, and this is Indonesia. Okay, so it's not comparable. So it's huge infection in Australia, which is still going on at the moment as well. But in terms of death as well, so in death per 1 million, I think in the origin, in the previous period of pandemic, Australia managing well. You can see here the death in Indonesia and India, and then Indonesia per million. So Indonesian death per million is much higher than India. But now Australia is also catching up, I think, the number of deaths here in terms of per million people. So I remember talking to a friend, like kind of last year, before Australia was hit, that, okay, so how successful is Australia managing this pandemic? And then my friend said that, and then how Indonesian is affected badly by this Delta wave in June. And then friend said, COVID-19 is a marathon, so it's not sprint. So we'll see what is the overall effect across 5 years, because it's still ongoing, and then it is. I realize now it is marathon. So so in terms of this is the effect of COVID-19 in Indonesia, Australia. I think the last wave here in Australia mostly because of Omicron. It's Omicron, and then also at the moment there's basically it's very limited public health intervention in terms of the restriction. I think so that's why the spread is quite widespread here compared to Indonesia, where the restriction I think is still in place. I think the main reason why there's not much restriction in Australia, I think we rely on the vaccination rate, which is very high. I think it has an effect on the reduce of hospitalization and death, but it's still very disruptive, I think, in economic and also in social scene. So in terms of the reported death accumulation, so it means that how many deaths due to COVID per million people until now. So United States is the worst one here. It's about 3,000 per million people has died throughout the pandemic. The average world is about 800 people per million. Indonesia about 563 per million, India about 374 per million, and then Australia about 254 per million. So Indonesia and Australia, in terms of per million population, the one that's reported case are not much different. And then you can see here the trajectory as well, and Australia is still increasing here. And then the other country has quite flat, I think. So how is the vaccination? So this is now the main tool of controlling the disease. And overall, it's about 65% of the world population has received at least one dose of vaccine. And then about 11 billion doses of vaccine has been administered globally. And then about 13 million administered each day. And then what the problem is that it's still there's a gap between a rich country and poorer country. It's only like 15% of people in poor countries receive one dose here. For example, Nigeria and Ethiopia, they are poorly vaccinated. Indonesia is here about 58%. Australia, I think somewhere here, I forgot to also, but it's about 90%. So similar with Singapore. So you can see here that unequal distribution of vaccine, which is one of the major problem at the moment. So So you can see the difference between high income, upper middle income, lower middle income country and low income country in terms of the number of doses of vaccine per 100 population. Yeah? So it's huge disparity here in terms of the vaccination. So there are probably some question about how effective is vaccine to reduce the hospitalization and death. So this figure probably illustrated how effective is vaccine. So let's say that initially, how many are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 60 people, okay, in the population. And then we probably hear a report that from hospital or that oh, okay, so 50%, there are, let's say that there are 10 people who died because of COVID, yeah, and then figures say that it's 50% of people who died because COVID are vaccinated, and the other 50% are unvaccinated. So that's not much different. Still, that if you get vaccinated and then you still die anyway. But if you see this, so this 5 people is out of 50 people who are vaccinated. So it's in terms of proportion is much smaller. 5 out of 50, that's about 10%, yeah. And then this is 5 out of 10. So it's almost half of people who are not vaccinated. So that's understanding how the vaccine is effective against death and hospitalization. So this is real data from the US. Until January 2009. So this is the number of people who died because of COVID divided by vaccination status. Okay, so 15 people out of 100,000 people died of COVID-19. Okay, they are unvaccinated, but only 2 out of 100,000 is fully vaccinated with no booster. And then fully vaccinated plus booster, so it's 3 doses, it's only 0.7 people out of 100 people died. So this is how effective is vaccine. So this is a real data from the US. And then also you can see here that from the case fatality rate is from 100 people who are infected with COVID-19, how many percent died? Okay, so in the early pandemic, in 2000, so about 8 to 9% people died, or 10% of people died of COVID. 10% of people who infected by COVID died in Indonesia in the early day of pandemic. And on world average is about 7. So remember in Indonesia that huge fatality rate of in COVID-19 because we don't do testing enough. Yeah, and we can see here that the case infection fatality rate has dropped. I think mostly due to vaccination here. Even Indonesia now it's around 4 or 3% people who are infected died because of COVID. In the world is about 2%. And then in Australia, because of vaccination, now it's much lower, about less, I think it's 0.5% or so, or less than 1%. So that's we know that the vaccination started here at the end of 2020. So it means that it's correlated with the vaccination and also previous infection. Okay, so we have. Okay, so in summary, and in conclusion, from the data that I have shown before, is that COVID-19 continued to affect world population. We know that probably the infection fatality rate is not as high as before, but it is still affecting world population. The number of infection is very high, and then it's still disruptive. I think we in Australia, for example, in the last 5 days, the airport is kind of there's some widespread kind of staff who need to be isolated, or airport staff who become infected. So it means that the queue is very long in the airport, and then also in the UK, where a lot of flight was cancelled because of COVID-19. And then it is predicted to become endemic. Endemic doesn't mean that it is less disruptive or less lethal. It just means that it will be staying with us for a long time or forever, with some, so it means that it will be us here for some time. And then it's it will affect us, but it's not like kind of a huge jump like before, like in terms of a pandemic where there's acceleration of cases. The virus will continue to evolve and mutate, so we know that I mean, virus does not stop as long as it's transmitted and then it's replicated, it will mutate. And then we don't know that whether mutation will due to less severe variants or more severe variant, but it's usually, I think from the previous experience, usually much more transmissible. We know that it's not like the Omicron has 4 different versions now, BA1, BA2, BA3, and BA4. The availability and widespread of use vaccine, widespread use of vaccine combined with previous infection have lessened the fatality rate of subsequent waves. So it means that the people who infected with COVID is not high risk of death or hospitalization compared to before vaccination. And then one of the main problem, I think probably related to social science here, is that the vaccine are not equally distributed, I think, and then we can see from the figure that low-income countries are disadvantaged. So I mean, you are interested, I wrote a couple of op-ed opinion in Kompas in the early pandemic, herd immunity and COVID-19 in the early 2022, when the government think at the time to just let the virus spread and then to build herd immunity. And then I said that no, that's not a good idea. So it means that the implementation of public health restriction should be done. Yeah? And then the other one is who need to be vaccinated first. So this is in the early vaccination era in Indonesia, where the government just started to vaccinate it, but I see that a lot of the policy was not according to public health guidance, where a lot of people who should not be prioritized vaccination get the vaccination, but people who need to be vaccinated, such as people with comorbidity, people old age, was not high in the queue. So that's why I wrote this one as well, saying that we need to prioritize people who are more likely to have high risk for COVID death and hospitalization. And just promotion. So we are here at the Australian Centre for Precision Health at the University of Australia. We do a lot of public health, genomic, and then also translation of the finding into clinic, into real life situation. And with that, I would like to end with terima kasih. Terima kasih banyak atas undangannya. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Beben Benjamin, for your outstanding presentation. We have actually learned about the public health aspects of COVID-19, something we don't really learn as much in the social and political science department. And from Professor Beben Benjamin's presentation, we have learned that several countries are comparable in terms of population and the widespread rate of this COVID-19 disease. And also, coronavirus is actually mutating and will stay with us for some time as an endemic. But there are ways to mitigate the spread of this virus even further. For example, by vaccination, giving the right vaccines to those who need the most, for example, those with high risk of death and transmission, and as well as comparing the income of rich and poor countries. There are still disparity in terms of vaccine distribution. So that's something that the government needs to work on. Thank you very much, Professor Beben Benjamin, for your outstanding presentation. And the question and answer will be organized together after Dr. Ian Wilson have finished his presentation. So next, let us welcome Dr. Ian Wilson as our second speaker of this plenary session. The time is yours.
Thanks very much, Pak Luthfi. Selamat pagi semua.
Selamat pagi.
Terima kasih atas undangan untuk bicara hari ini. I also appreciate and recognize that I'm allowed to speak in my native language of English, even though I think I'm perhaps the only native speaker here, and I appreciate that. It makes it much easier for me, and I very much appreciate the fact that you're listening to me and responding to me in English. I look forward to the day when we have a conference in Australia where it's an expectation that we all speak in our non-native language for us in Indonesian. I think it might be a bit longer before we have that. Okay, I'm going to share a screen if I can. Okay, give me a second. Yep. Okay, so in thinking about what to discuss today, it's been a kind of a process of a bit of melancholy. It's been 2 years and 6 months now since I've been in Indonesia. It's the longest time I've not been in Indonesia for, I think, maybe 30 years now. It feels like a long time, and I'm looking forward to being able to visit you again soon. The past 2 years has been, of course, a difficult time for everybody. And in thinking about what I wanted to discuss today, I wanted to reflect to begin with on some of the experiences of the pandemic in Australia, and specifically where I've been in Western Australia, and then to provide an analysis of the responses in Indonesia. I'm a political sociologist by training, and one of the things that's been interesting to me to observe throughout the pandemic has been what it can tell us about the different constellations of interests and the relationships between different levels of government and governance, and also between different levels of government and society. And so perhaps in contrast with Beben, who's provided a very concise and informative presentation, I'm hoping to instead to provide something of a provocative argument for the sake of discussion. I wanted to engage firstly with what's been a kind of a prevailing analysis that we've seen of Indonesian democracy over the past decade, and that's the democratic decline argument. This has been an argument, and I'll go through some of the contours of it in a moment, that's emerged out of scholarship trying to understand the trajectory of Indonesian democracy over the past decade in particular. And I wanted to use that argument as a basis for analysing different levels of response in pandemic response in Indonesia, from the national level, where I think the argument actually has some credence, that some of the failings of the national response to the pandemic in Indonesia can be explained by aspects of this democratic decline argument. Though I want to vary or critique aspects of that argument and suggest that some of the great success stories that we've seen in Indonesia in the pandemic response speak to some of the strengths of Indonesia's democratic trajectory. And these haven't occurred at the national level, but they've occurred at other levels of government. We've seen extremely successful responses from provincial and municipal level government responses to the pandemic, particularly in the early stages. And we've also seen, again, the strength and resilience of Indonesia's civic participation from community organisations, social organisation and religious networks as providing crucial information and support services as part of the pandemic response. So if I summarise at the beginning, my conclusion, it's been that we've seen real problems in the national government response in Indonesia, which I think reflect the constellation of oligarchic interests that make up the national elite in Indonesia, but that more popularly elected regional and municipal level leaders who are more attuned to the social interests that have brought them to power have responded much better to the pandemic. That's sort of my end argument at the start. Now, in thinking about Australia as a point of comparison, it's been definitely a strange time. For those of you who may know Australia, Perth is in fact the most geographically isolated part, not just of Australia, but one of the most geographically isolated cities in the world. And that's served us relatively well in the pandemic, where our geographic isolation has meant that Western Australia, and this is in contrast to other parts of the country, has remained fairly free of COVID-19 up until very recently. In fact, at this very moment, we're undergoing perhaps our greatest wave. Nonetheless, we've seen a number of problems, and these in many respects have been global problems in response to the pandemic. Years of neoliberal cuts to public services, such as health, has meant that the government has relied largely on borders and the closing of borders as a main means of protecting the population. We've also seen what in the Australian context have been alarming trends of the securitization of public health responses, with the police and the military in particular taking on leadership roles and policing roles when it comes to both vaccination and COVID-19 protocol policing measures. And in the context of a country such as Australia, this has been to many people quite an alarming trend, but also indicative of how, a period of, a couple of decades of neoliberal cuts to public services has meant that in a time of unprecedented crisis, public services such as health haven't been adequate, and we've seen militarization of what is essentially a public health crisis. We've also witnessed patterns of inequality and the exacerbation of inequality in how the pandemic has been policed. So, for example, in Australia, we see the deployment of the military to enforce lockdowns mid last year in the midst of the Delta wave, and this policing was representative of particular structural discrimination. So southwestern Sydney, for example, which is home to Australia's largest Muslim population, was highly policed. In fact, many argued it was over-policed, reflecting longer standing practices of the hyper-policing of so-called suspected communities. And this is an extension, in a sense, of the war on terror and some of the policing practices that have emerged out of this. So even in ostensibly highly functional democracies such as Australia, we've seen significant missteps, significant lags and delays, and also the reproduction in COVID-19 policy responses of structural bias and discrimination, as well as particular kinds of vested interests over the public good. Perhaps one of the, to me as a political scientist, one of the most interesting manifestations, and this I think has some interesting correlations to Indonesia, have been the significant tensions that have emerged between different levels of government. So state governments, Australia is a federated system where we have states and territories that have their own elected governments, and then we have a federal government, a national government operating out of Canberra. We've seen unprecedented tensions between state governments and the national government, to the point that some have even questioned the nature of Australia's federation, the nature of the existing system, and of relationships between state and federal governments. This, in a sense, reflects broader trends towards political populism, where national government has become increasingly focused on short-term political gains and the undermining of broader public institutions, with the delivery of services increasingly outsourced, but also the preserve of state government. So in a time of crisis such as COVID-19, we've seen many state governments respond very promptly, very concisely, where the federal government, the national government, has often been broadly perceived as either negligent, trying to overemphasizing the economy over public health needs. And this in turn has played out in particular tensions over the nature of federal or national and state level governments. So let me just move on. I wanted to say a couple of things before I focus on the Indonesia case, and Pak Beben has in a sense already covered quite a bit of this material, so I won't labor on it for too long. When I was thinking about my presentation, I focused on the topic of the conference and the term post-pandemic recovery. And I think that while there is, of course, a very clear need to be both optimistic and forward planning in our analysis, we shouldn't forget that large parts of the world's population, including many in Indonesia, the pandemic is far from over. 35% of the world's population has yet to receive a single vaccine dose. Around 42% are not yet fully vaccinated. That comes out at roughly 3 million people. And like many crises, this distribution of risk has reflected existing inequalities in the global system. We can see on the map, for example, that I have up on the screen, that poorer African countries in particular have had great difficulties in accessing vaccines and to delivering vaccinations to their populations. So unequal vaccine coverage and vaccine inequity has been a significant structural barrier to protecting the globe's most vulnerable. And of course, in something like a global pandemic, when some are vulnerable, we all, remain vulnerable. This also, to a lesser extent, extends to Indonesia, where significant segments of the population are still not vaccinated. My figures are that there are roughly 35 million eligible Indonesians who have not yet been vaccinated at all. And the distribution of vaccine rates is very much reflective, and this will sort of segue into my core argument, of the infrastructure and competencies of regional governments. So we can compare very high vaccination rates in West Java and Central Java, for example, with underdeveloped areas such as Papua, which has only roughly 24% of the population who've received a second dose. So these inequalities of coverage have remained a significant issue. Okay. Now, what I wanted to do from here on in is to reflect on what has been, and I hope speaking to social scientists and political scientists, many of you will be familiar with these broad arguments that have sort of dominated a lot of political science scholarship on Indonesia over the past decade. I wanted to reflect on the democratic decline argument and the argument of a number of scholars of Indonesian politics who've argued that the democratic decline process that's characterized Indonesia's democracy over the past decade has very much influenced the national government response, with a general consensus being that the national government response in Indonesia, particularly in the early stages of the pandemic, had significant flaws, and I'll address some of those in turn. Now, for those who aren't familiar with the democratic decline argument, there are a number of scholars who've outlined it: Eve Warburton, Edward Aspinall, Marcus Meitzner, Burhanuddin, and others. And there's a number of key features that they suggest are indicative of what they argue has been the decline in Indonesia's, the quality of Indonesia's democracy over the past decade. And this is against the backdrop of the transformations of reformasi post-1998, Indonesia's quite remarkable transformation from the authoritarian New Order period to an incredibly lively multi-party democracy of the early 2000s, and the consolidations of institutional electoral democracy in what is now one of the largest electoral democracies in the world. There has, however, been an assessment that we've seen a decline or a shift in the quality of Indonesia's democracy, particularly over the past two presidential periods. A couple of these, and this is sort of giving an overview of the scholarship on this, that these are a couple of key characteristics of democratic decline. One is political polarization and the rise of political populism. Of course, we've seen in the past few presidential elections deep social and political polarization around particular political identities. To kind of to summarize Islamist versus pluralist constructions of identity and different contesting visions of Indonesia, which some have argued have been often quite cynical electoral strategies of political elites, which have nonetheless had significant, often deeply corrosive social impacts at the societal level in Indonesia. And that this polarization has negative social impacts for the substance of Indonesia's democracy. Another feature that's identified by most of the scholars has been increased repression of civil society as a feature that's emerged over the past decade. We've seen the Ummu, for example, used frequently by political elites to intimidate and silence critics, including NGOs and transparency organisations of the government. We've also seen the use of executive power to ban organisations rather than judicial process, such as, for example, Hizbut Tahrir and Front Pembela Islam. Another aspect is seen as the undermining of anti-corruption measures. One of the great success stories of Indonesia's post-reformasi democratic transformation has been the establishment of strong anti-corruption institutions such as the KPK. And one of the great sort of challenges to Indonesia has been the political attacks that we've seen on the KPK over the past few years, which has significantly weakened its autonomy and its capacity to pursue high-level corruption within government. And this is, again, seen as a feature of democratic decline. Another feature has been the resurgent role of the military in civil and political affairs, and also, again, a sense that some of the key advances post-1998 of the end of Dui Fungsi, the end of the military's direct role in political affairs, that some of this has started to roll back. Now there is, and most of the surveys indicate this, that there remains broad public support in Indonesia for democracy, but there are significant numbers who do not support or show limited support for democratic protections, checks, and freedom. So that's sort of, in a sense, characterizing the democratic decline argument and some of the features of it. Now, in looking at the pandemic response of Indonesia at the national level, some scholars, such as Mietzner and Aspinall, have used the democratic decline argument to explain the nature of the national government's response. And they've argued that this, again, has been characterized by a number of particular features which can be more broadly framed within the shift in Indonesia, the tone of Indonesia's democratic trajectory. One which Mietzner identifies is populist anti-scientism, arguing that in the early stages of the pandemic, that we saw particularly populist politicians in various forms of denialism. We even had the Minister for Health spruiking kind of nativist remedies, and that a particular kind of anti-scientist populism was a strong feature that gained particular political traction early on. Another core argument has been that the national government has really heavily invested in the economy and infrastructure as a populist centerpiece, and that the Jokowi administration in particular has focused on infrastructural development really as the kind of core focus of particularly this second term. And Aspinall, for example, has attributed the initially quite slow and haphazard national response to a president and a ruling elite who from the outset really strongly focused more on the potential economic impacts of the crisis rather than foregrounding the health dimensions. So both Aspinall and Meissner have suggested that reasons for this choice can be traced to the president's sort of single-minded focus on economic development and the political investment that his political fortunes would be inexorably tied to the ability to deliver strong economic growth and improvements in living standards, in a sense, sort of overlearning some of the lessons of Indonesia's recent history. So in this context, the pandemic initially appeared almost as an irritant to the national government, an unwanted distraction of both energy and resources. It problematized key infrastructural and economic goals, such as the centerpiece construction of a new capital city in Kalimantan. And this arguably facilitated, it's been argued by these scholars, a response or stance that saw the pandemic's impacts almost as a kind of political threat to be managed accordingly, rather than faced directly for what it was, a serious challenge on the government to deliver what was needed to best protect the public. So we saw this argument that populist political investment in particular economic and infrastructural outcomes as the centerpiece of government really detracted from a coherent initial response to the pandemic. And this isn't something in many respects that's limited to Indonesia. We've seen a feature of populist governments globally where the pandemic's impacts on health and economic security has not infrequently been understood within a kind of a zero-sum frame of political survival. So populist governments have seen the pandemic less in terms of, okay, we need to provide for our public, but as an actual threat to their own political survival. And in many cases, ruling populists have reacted by downplaying the threat of the pandemic in the early stages, and also by accusing their critics, including expert critics and the sidelining of expertise, public health experts, medical experts, and taking their expert advice as an attempt to disrupt their governments. The most well-known cases of that are, of course, the Trump administration in the United States, who engaged in serious forms of denialism and anti-scientism in their initial response to the pandemic, and also the Bolsonaro administration in Brazil, again, another populist regime that responded very poorly, responding in very high numbers of infections and very high mortality rates amongst their populations. There's also been the argument that corruption and clientelism has also significantly impacted the national level response in Indonesia. This includes, as I've already mentioned, the weakening of the KPK and the consolidation of oligarchic interests in national government and major political parties. But more in a longer frame, public health in particular, as has been well documented, has been undermined over the years by systemic corruption with lots of funds siphoned away from regional health. So when it comes to a moment of crisis, there's been a problem where local and regional health infrastructure simply hasn't been up to the task. This has played out in undeveloped health infrastructure, the lack of resources to quickly procure test kits, etc., which made certainly in the early stages of the pandemic, Indonesia was the country with, in fact, the lowest level of per capita COVID testing in Southeast Asia. Another argument has been the assertiveness of anti-democratic actors. It's a theory that moments of crisis often present particular challenges to democratic societies, where anti-democratic forces, both within and outside of government, can use crisis to put through exemplary measures. And it's been argued that we've seen this also in the case in Indonesia, where the conditions of the pandemic have seen the pushing through of controversial packages of laws, the omnibus laws, for example, as well as the consolidation of the military in key roles to do with the pandemic. Again, reflecting a broader global trend that we've seen of the securitization and in some cases militarization of government responses to public health crises. So let me move on here. So there's been a number of trends that we've seen in the Indonesian case over the pandemic. And again, I'm emphasizing here the national level. I'll shift my emphasis to regional and local level responses in a moment. One has been that the pandemic response has exposed and exacerbated various inequalities within and across Indonesian society. These are of the poor. And again, a lot of my research in Indonesia over the past few years has been on urban poor politics in Jakarta. And we saw very clearly early on that the poor had very limited access to both information and also resources to manage the pandemic. That included, of course, economic resources, remembering that large segments of the urban poor in Indonesia rely on the informal sector, which expose people to greater levels of risk of infection because they're operating and residing in the public space. We also saw the exacerbation of existing inequalities in remote regions and the difficulties of vaccination rates. Again, that's still reflected in provinces such as Papua and West Papua, where full vaccination rates remain in the low 20%, despite being a couple of years into the pandemic. And more broadly speaking, problems with health infrastructure. We've seen also tensions between expertise versus politics. And again, I should emphasize that while I'm speaking specifically about Indonesia, these are broader trends that we've seen, certainly we've seen in Australia, but also throughout the world. Expertise versus politics has often entailed the sidelining of experts that are critical of government responses, the use of political appointments to key roles in managing the pandemic, which again has often reflected the constellations of interests within particular ruling national elites, and the difficulties still faced in democracies, particularly where forms of clientelist politics dominate elite configurations of power, where political appointments again will trump those of expertise. I won't go into the specific examples in Indonesia, but certainly we can see even to this day there are ongoing controversies around the health minister, for example, and the appropriateness of their role and others in providing expert advice on the pandemic. One of the things that's been most interesting to me to observe Indonesia's response from afar has also been local and national tensions. And these have very much I think been broadly to the detriment of the overall coherence of the national pandemic response in Indonesia, particularly political rivalries among political elites. And we've seen, for example, some of the tensions that have emerged. And of course, one of the things that I always have observed about Indonesian politics is that as soon as a presidential election is over, say within 6 months, everyone's talking and focusing on the next presidential election. So you have about 3 years where politics is shaped by forthcoming elections and the positioning and pushing and shoving of different interests in relation to that. And that's been very much the case with some of the tensions between provincial level governments and leaders and the national government. So, for example, we saw tensions between the national government not imposing lockdowns early in that pandemic, and then the responses of governors and provincial leaders such as Anies Baswedan as the governor of Jakarta, and tensions playing out that weren't simply about the best policy response, but very much occurred within a political economy of interests, where competent responses by political rivals were seen often as threats, and that political tensions between various elites ultimately played out in undermining the coherency and coordination across the various levels of government in response to the pandemic. We also have seen, I think, and this is a point I'll revisit in just a moment, deeper rifts between the worlds of elite politicians, and by elite politicians I'm talking primarily about national level government, and those levels of government engaged in what I call more immediate management of social problems at the local level. So whilst we've seen at the national level, initially in the pandemic, forms of initially denialism and a very slow start in Indonesia, I think it was March 2020, the World Health Organization was already asking the Indonesian government for a more serious response. And the initial response from the Indonesian national government was that there were no cases, in fact, in the country. But at the same time, we saw local level governments, and by local I mean tingkat provinsi, kabupaten, and further down the line, often responding very strongly and very quickly. And I think this is an interesting point of observation in a moment of crisis, that different levels of government, many of which who've come to power through the mobilization of social interests to become popularly elected local politicians, have often been, I think, much more successful in able to procure resources and to mobilize policies to deliver what's needed to the public. And I think this has been, again, a strong observable trend that we've seen throughout the country in different ways throughout the pandemic. The other trend that we've seen, and again, this is something that always comes to the fore in Indonesia in any moment of crisis, has been the very strong traditions of civic volunteerism that have played an ultimately very crucial role. And this spans everything from various civil society and religious organizations, that includes Muhammadiyah, Nahdlatul Ulama, and others who from very early on provided a relatively coherent, firstly, recognition of the nature of the pandemic, doing a lot to counter some of the disinformation and hoaxes that were circulating within society that sort of undermined some of the early vaccine efforts, but also the whole array of civic volunteerism in Indonesia, different volunteers or grassroots networks that often serve to fill the gaps or to lead the way, in fact, ahead of government responses in information. I think in many cases, civil society mobilizations around the pandemic were often ahead of those of government responses. And this speaks, I think, to an enduring strength of Indonesian civil society. And this is sort of a point I wanted to use to go into the next kind of aspect of my argument. So let me just change my slides. So the democratic decline argument, as articulated by Aspinall, by Mietzner, and a range of scholars, has been used to explain what they argue has been an arguably poor response from the national government at the initial and early stages of the pandemic. However, my counter argument to that is that whilst the democratic decline argument, I think, can explain a lot about the national level trajectories of government in Indonesia, where I think there is, I'm in broad agreement that there is significant challenges to the trajectory of Indonesia's democracy at the national level, the consolidation of oligarchic interests, the use of polarized populism as a discourse for politics, which I think has deeply corrosive impacts on societal cohesion, but also undermines coherent public responses to crises. That corruption at higher levels of government has become more of a problem simply through the fact that key institutions and key successes of Indonesia's post-democratic transition, such as the KPK, has been significantly undermined, and that all of these have played out in the national response. Now, in contrast to this, and this is where I diverge from the democratic decline argument, I think that the emphasis has always been primarily on national government. So Meissner's analysis, he wrote a very good article early in the pandemic using the democratic decline argument to explain the national response, focuses almost solely on the responses of the central government, without reckoning with the significant developments during 2 decades of neoliberal state transformation that, certainly in the case of Indonesia, have shifted budgets and organizational capacities, and this includes public health responses such as for infectious disease, to the district, so the kabupaten, and also the sub-districts or kecamatan and municipal kota madya levels. So while acknowledging that there are real limitations of institutional responses in the country, I think the democratic decline argument doesn't account for the proliferation of lower levels of effective responses, of independent community organising and effective local level government responses that have provided many of the frontline responses to the social, economic and health crisis that have followed the pandemic. So notably, some of the most coherent responsive strategies have come from district and municipal governments who early on enforced their own lockdowns, drove coordinated contact tracing regimes, and often set up their own support services. So particularly in districts and municipalities in Indonesia with histories of popular social and political mobilization, as well as electoral campaigns for district heads and mayors, they're often driven by local organizations and local social groups. We saw many much more rapid responses in providing social assistances. And these governments were often able to provide PPE, protective equipment for health workers in hospitals and in puskesmas, and subsequently didn't experience as high levels of infection amongst health workers. So while this sort of the political decentralization in Indonesia has been very much a neoliberal project, the actual development of local political structures reflects the extent of elite capture, or conversely, the adoption of reformist programs that are often more responsive to community interests. And I think the pandemic has brought this to the fore, where we've seen reformist popular programs that mobilize interests at a local level, and that can be, again, kabupaten provincial level, translating to often quite effective responses to the pandemic. So at a provincial level, we had provincial governments elected on relatively broad-based popular support, such as those in West and Central Java, who were able to produce or secure medical supplies, coordinate regional lockdowns and tracing regimes, and provide social assistance budgets, a comprehensive and competent response. However, we also saw in provinces such as South Sulawesi, provincial and district governments actively misusing social assistance funds to strengthen party cartels and attract voters before upcoming regional elections. So it was, in a sense, a kind of a litmus test to the configuration of interests around particular provincial governments in particular that helps to explain, I think, variations from very competent responses such as Central and West Java, and those that really kind of failed the test, one example being in South Sulawesi. Now, aside from that provincial level, and I should say, but Luthfi, if you can advise me on time, because I'm not sure if I've got a lot of time or a short amount of time. left?
We have around 20 minutes left.
Oh, still, okay, still lots of time. Okay,
Yeah.
thanks. So we also see local government responses being buttressed and supported, if not in some cases superseded, by the emergence of many local community mobilizations around age-old neighbourhood administration systems as a means of, sorry, my screen stopped sharing there. Okay, sorry, my screen's gone funny, but I'll just keep speaking. That these local government, local grassroots responses have served often to lead the way in community responses. So reflecting on communities that I know very well in Jakarta, such as in North Jakarta, some of the poor urban neighborhoods in Luar Batang, Penjaringan, Kampung Aquarium and Muara Baru, we saw that strong practices of social solidarity, of long relationships with supportive NGOs provided as a really effective network of support that saw many of these communities acting proactively prior to government intervention. So I know in the case of Kampung Aquarium, for example, before even the national or city administration in Jakarta had introduced any kind of social distancing or lockdown measures, the community had already met a number of times and concluded that they needed to take proactive action, and they engaged in their own kampung level lockdowns and monitoring of movements of people. And this is in many respects reflective of the reality of the urban poor, self-reliance, and a recognition that when it comes to crisis, they need to rely on each other and their support networks rather than waiting for intervention from the state. And I think there's a lot to be learned in the coordination of different levels of public responses to pandemic. And of course, the pandemic isn't over, and we will see crises like this again in the future, in drawing on these experiences of local level solidarity and support networks as effective means for mitigating risk, particularly against some of the most vulnerable communities in Indonesia, the urban poor, those in remote regions with limited access to significant health infrastructure, or those who are living in governments that are less functional in terms of procuring and providing adequate health services, that this provides a solid, not a substitute, but a solid foundation to build upon in more effective public health responses. Okay, I'm just trying to share again here, sorry. Saya cukup gaptek kalau soal Zoom because we don't use Zoom in our system in Australia. We use another one, so I apologise for my poor use of it here. So just in summary, the pandemic has exposed and exacerbated inequalities and inequities globally, but reflecting on the case of Indonesia, also in Indonesian society. The pandemic has not been experienced across Indonesian society in the same way, with the poor and the precarious in particular, and those in underdeveloped regions exposed to greater risks from the virus, as well as from the various impacts and measures introduced to tackle it. Reflecting, of course, that lockdowns of different kinds had significant socioeconomic impacts on the poor who rely on accessing public space as a source of livelihood production. Now, one of the central factors in certainly the national government's early failures to control the pandemic at crucial periods arguably lies with decision-making processes at the national level. And I think here that the democratic decline argument does help to explain some of the problems that we've seen at the national level, the national government level response that was often framed by oligarchic consensus and particular political interests of the ruling administration, that prioritized in particular the economic dimension above the necessity of public health. Does that mean that the democratic decline argument holds for all of Indonesia? My argument, and I'll conclude on this point, is no, that is not. While we saw significant failures in the response of national government in Indonesia to the pandemic, we saw that popularly elected governments at other levels, municipal levels, provincial levels, supported by an array of social interests who supported them, had voted for them, in many cases were involved in political contracts of various kinds, which have been a key feature of Indonesia's electoral democracy, were often able to respond very effectively, often in deep contrast, if not open conflict with the slow response of national governments. So I think the overall assessment would be that these local levels of government response show a lot of promise for the trajectory of Indonesia's democracy. There's a lot of gloom and doom analysis of the national level government. I think it's hard not to agree with it, but that we can see there's plenty to be optimistic about when we look at the combination of civic volunteerism across the board, and that extends from large mass organizations such as large religious organizations through to the most local level, and also the impacts of these on popularly elected governments at the provincial and Kabupaten level. And that this is something that should, I think, be learnt from and reflected upon in preparation for crises, public crises in the years ahead. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ian Wilson, for your presentation. Dr. Ian Wilson's presentation have explored the comparison, first of all, between Australia's national response from the federal government in comparison to Indonesia's national response, which is quite late. And Dr. Ian Wilson have already emphasized that the late response from our national government in Indonesia was due to several parties' interests, political interests inside the government. For example, the prioritization of prioritizing economic interests over public health. And also there are several political competition between parties within the government who do not want to address this pandemic quicker because of scientific denial and other reasons related to the use of budget. And despite the unexpected government response, which is quite slow, Dr. Ian Wilson have emphasized that local governments from Indonesian provincial governments as well as non-governmental organizations, LSM, have already actually provided effective response in the local level, such as providing information and also lockdown measures in the local level, which needs to be appreciated and in which we highlight as Dr. Ian Wilson's research finding on this topic, quite different from previous researches conducted by Mitzner and also Professor Aspinall. Thank you very much to both of our speakers for your wonderful presentation. And right now it's the time for the question and answer session. I would like to repeat the rules of this question and answer session. If you have a question for one of our speakers, or you may also ask a question to both of our speakers, please use the raise hand feature. So you click on reactions and then you use the raise hand, and our host will turn on your microphone so that you could ask the question directly to one of our speakers. Otherwise, you may also type in your question in the chat box of this Zoom meeting, and I will read out the question to our speakers today. All right, ladies and gents, if you have a question, please use the raise hand feature, and we will turn on your microphone to ask the question. Okay. All right, so we have a question. The first question is from Ms. Rida Amalia.
Thank you for the opportunity. First, thank you for Professor Beben and Pak Beben and Pak Ian Wilson. If I may call you Pak Beben and Pak Wilson. So thank you for enlightening us regarding the both topic. Both topics are very interesting, very stimulating. I have several questions that I'd like to address. There are two questions to Pak Beben, and there are one questions to Pak Ian. First, to Pak Beben, it is thank you for giving us a very interesting highlight about the public health system, Pak Beben. My question is, first one is, to what extent do you think that the social cultural factors shapes or determines the direction of public health system of a country in general? I mean, in general. So because I think a lot of scholars have argued that the social cultural factor shapes or determines the public health system. But what do you think about this? To what extent it determines the public health system itself? Because, you know, at the beginning of the pandemic, especially in Indonesia, you've mentioned this also earlier, that the discussion about, you know, herd immunity spread. So at the beginning of pandemic, not only the virus spread, but also the discourse or the discussion about herd immunity also spread largely, mostly from the WhatsApp group or WhatsApp chats. And then suddenly people become the, you know, public health experts, and not let alone people want to know the original sources of the chats of the article itself. So what do you think about the social cultural factors that can shape the public health system itself? And then the second question is, this is about the post-pandemic perspective, I guess. What do you think, or what's your perspective about the future of public health system itself? I mean, what we should anticipate, since it is predicted that it to become endemic, that you've mentioned earlier. Because I assume that, you know, at the end of the day, the world or the global community will always have to deal, or we manage the outbreak instead of get rid of the outbreak itself for good. So what should we anticipate so that we can manage the outbreak, you know, in the future, to be more prepared in the future? And then my third question is, I address these questions to Jan. You've mentioned about the flawed national pandemic responses done by the Indonesian government, but amidst the dynamic itself, the dynamic of national pandemic responses, I also agree that local or community level has contributed greatly to mitigate the social and economic impacts due to the pandemic. And it is also interesting that you use the expression of national disasters instead of global pandemic or outbreak, because each country has their own way to mitigate the national disaster. If not, we call it as a global pandemic. So I'd like to know your perspective on how these community initiatives can address, or can even, you know, inspire the more stable or balanced and trustworthy the national pandemic responses. This is to, you know, to be learned by the national government. So what? We have a potential, we have assets in the community level. So what can we do to mitigate this to the national disaster in terms of in the future national disaster, we can say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Rida, for your question. So I believe the question is addressed to both of our speakers, to both Professor Beben and also Dr. Ian Wilson. So Professor Beben, would you like to answer first?
Okay, thank you, Bu Rida, for the question. Before that, so I would like to thanks Pak Ian for insightful discussion, because I think when I heard your explanation about what's happening for the last 2 years in Indonesia, I kind of reflect what I experienced as well here when I also part of the Lapor COVID organization, were kind of providing some advice, and then the kind of the threat that we feel from the government, that we are like voicing a concern which a different with the government view. It felt like we just like talking about the security of our communication. What was everything? It's surreal. Yeah. So that's it's I'm kind of reflecting back for my previous 2 years experience, which I forgot now, but I think you just kind of remind me again all this situation. In fact, it's quite I can discuss again with you, but it is quite real, I think, what you said.
Yeah, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah. So in terms of the question from Mbak Rida about social factor affecting the public health system, it is in fact we cannot separate between public health response with in social context. I think probably that's one of the most important aspects. For example, in instituting to make the intervention of lockdown, for example, you cannot do lockdown without considering the social aspect of the effect of that lockdown. I mean, by doing lockdown without providing access to food or to the kind of other necessity, will doom to fail, because people need to survive. So I think that's one case in Indonesia where the government didn't want to use the UU Quarantina, where there's some responsibility from the government to provide the necessities to the public when they want to institute lockdown. But instead, they create a new rule which basically doesn't require government to provide that necessity for public to survive during the lockdown. So I think a social factor is needed. In terms of the overall response as well, I think people now recognize that probably a better access to paid leave because of COVID, probably it's much better effect in terms of compliant people who are positive or who are close contact to stay at home, because like for marginal population where they don't have means to be out of work for 1 or 2 days. So I think providing them with the paid sick leave is one of the better approach rather than a strict approach. So it is important factor for public health systems, and all the social aspect need consideration, because like lockdown can affect differently between social economic status. For example, people who has a house with a garden, probably it's much easier for them to isolate rather than people who are in the apartment block, where you are kind of crammed into smaller space for several weeks or months. I think so. That's it's important consideration. So sometimes the guiding policy was based on the people who are on elite level, where they don't. Sometimes they forgot how bad is the situation for people who are living in that condition. So I think that's important of the social factor to be taken into consideration as well. On question of the post-pandemic effect, what will need to be done, given that we know that the virus will be us for some time and it will become endemic. I think living with virus doesn't mean that we just ignore and then we come back to pre-pandemic, where we just said, okay, we know that the disease will be here for us, and then if we are vaccinated, I mean, the effect will be much lower in terms of hospitalization or severity or even risk of dying. But there are some aspect of a public health intervention or public health policy that can still be implemented to reduce the effect and the transmission, which does not need to be kind of harsh as before. For example, I mean, improved ventilation now has been recognized as one of the major important public health intervention post-pandemic, because we understand now about the transmission mode, that the majority of transmission is through aerosol, where it happened within the indoor confined space, and then by improving the ventilation or moving a lot of activity outdoor, building better building with improved ventilation, that will reduce the transmission. The other thing is masking on very high risk settings, such as hospital, public transport, and then aged care facilities or other high risk things still are important, because that's where the transmission occur, and then also the consequence of getting infected for people in that setting is very high. For example, in aged care, when you get infected, most likely to die is very high, although it's vaccinated. The other thing, it's also continue to increase vaccination level. I think the booster will be with us for some time. I think so. I don't think at the moment, from most of the evidence, that 2 doses of vaccination is enough. So I think to counter the Omicron, I think 3 vaccination is better. And then also now for people who are high risk, immunocompromised, older age, or people who have comorbidity, also now in Australia starting to get the 4th booster or 4th vaccination. So I think that can be implemented as well in Indonesia. But I think probably the most important thing in Indonesia as well before that is to make sure that everyone has access to the 1 or 2nd vaccine first, which Pak Ian mentioned in his presentation. We also realized that the coverage in Indonesia is not well distributed. Like, for example, the Eastern Indonesia's vaccination has not been as good as the Jakarta or Java. So I think there are a number of things that we can still continue living with COVID, which means that we don't like completely ignore all the public health measure, but it means that the level and then also the type of public health measure is different, dealing with virus where majority of people has been vaccinated or has been infected. So I think that's my take on the post-pandemic.
Thank you very much, Professor Beben. So next would be Dr. Ian Wilson's turn to answer Ms. Rida's question.
Right. Thank you, and thanks for a very good question. It's actually a very difficult question to answer succinctly, but I'll try and approach it maybe at a theoretical level, and then at the case of Indonesia. As someone trained in political economy, my assumption is usually that government reactions and policy always reflect the interests of the various actors that are driving that policy. And so I think, and I hope I was able to convey that, I think what we've seen in the Indonesian case reflects that, where we have a national government that is very much driven by the interests of those groups that constitute the national government. And I don't think it's controversial to say that there's a strong consolidation of oligarchic interests within the national government. And this is very much reflected in the kinds of approaches that we saw in their policy. Now, when we look at other levels of government, and that can be everywhere down to, I have lots of anecdotes from my former, fieldwork sites of RT and RW, and the absolutely fundamental role that RT and RW as the direct interface between neighborhoods and populations served in coordinating responses. I think when you have different constellations of interests, and that includes public interests and includes social organizations that may have been fundamental to a district head being elected, that can reflect, not necessarily, but it can reflect in responses that more immediately deal with what the public needs. And I think if you can explain some of the gaps between the national governments, particularly in the early stages of the pandemic, when there was outright denialism, this is unfolding globally, and the national government just didn't even want to know about it because it was deeply invested in particular populist political projects of economic development. This was a problem to them. It wasn't a crisis. The government, of course, should come to the fore, and that's what it's for, right? To deliver these things for the public when they need them. It didn't do that initially. Other levels of government are much more intimately intertwined with other social interests that demanded things. They wanted a response. They needed help. And I think that's really, in some respects, a reflection of scale of politics. We saw the same thing in Australia, where the national government, the federal government, initially responded very poorly to the pandemic, and it was state governments, Victoria, Western Australia, South Australia, Queensland, that really were on the front foot delivering, often popularly elected leaders. In Western Australia, our Premier was elected with, I think, 85% of the vote. It's an incredible high level of public support. And so he was really able to use that to respond in a pretty effective manner. So, I mean, in terms of your question, I think the problem is a political problem, that national government is increasingly reflective of the interests that constitute that government, and they're not necessarily public interests. We saw things such as, I'm often attuned to this just as a matter of interest. If you look at the disaster capitalism argument of someone like Naomi Klein, is that whenever you have a moment of crisis, particularly neoliberal interests will usually seek to capture that moment to introduce new kinds of radical changes in the system. Now, if we apply that to what we saw in the national government, we saw things, they didn't work, but they tried them. And I think that's the danger. Someone like Budi Sadikin, he's a banker by training, looking at allowing private firms to jump the national COVID vaccine queue. I mean, these are all indicative, I think, of the interests that constitute the national government. And there, I think the democratic decline argument is strong, because you see the consolidation of these interests in a way that's antithetical to democratic progress. Certainly liberal, I don't think Indonesia is a liberal democracy. Indonesia has its own trajectory, of course, and it shouldn't be put within that frame. I don't think that's useful. But nonetheless, based on what's happened since the end of the Reformasi, I think the national government's definitely had a democratic decline. The success story, so to speak, is that lower levels of government have responded to the challenge, but ultimately those responses are always going to be constrained by the national government. If they can't procure equipment, they can't procure what's needed through the national government, or as we saw, if the national government perceives competent provincial governments as a threat, which we did see because of the framing of political interests around 2024, someone like Anies Baswedan or Ganjar Pranowo or others who are seen as potential presidential candidates, it was very clear that their positive responses, and they were flawed, but they had some things they did very well, were perceived by the national government as a threat. And I think that's a problem a basic problem of government where political interest is trumping public interest. And that's always a problem in politics, but I think I don't have an answer for you. That's of course up to Indonesia to figure out. But I think the positive is that local government is receptive. I think that's a positive outcome of Indonesia's democracy. It's the strength of Indonesia's democracy at that interface between public need and government. But the national government, its it's increasingly divorced from that entirely. And I think that's a challenge into the future.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ian Wilson, for your answer. Ms. Rida, would you like to respond to Professor Beben and Dr. Ian's answers?
Thank you for your answer, Pak Beben and Pak Ian. I know that this is a very frustrating times. I guess to see how the national government responds to handle or to mitigate the outbreak itself. I mean, we often in Indonesia we often say that differences is a blessing. Perbedaan itu adalah rahmat, but this is not it. So the difference in how the local community levels are responding to the outbreak and the national government responding, even if we say national governments, who is the national government that we're talking about here? Because Anies Baswedan is part of, also I guess it's part of national government, but they often put him as a threat to the national government, so that we can see that the democratic decline that Ian said that it's happening in Indonesia, and then the emergence of those provincial leaders as the candidate in 2024 is really it's quite obvious happening right now. So yeah, I think there are no like the formula to know the. I mean, this is the initiative that's up. It's a potential for us to learn about how that we as a community or civic participation is very helpful to maintain or to mitigate the disaster itself. So in case this is happening in the future, then we can learn much more about this rather than, arguing in a political frame itself, I guess. Thank you, Pak Ian and Pak Beben for your answer. Thank you, Pak Luthfi.
Thank you very much, Ms. Rida, for your question. From Professor Beben's answer, I would like to repeat several points. The first point is that there are still some positive signs that we see happening in the society. For example, people are right now much more aware about the measures that we should implement in order to prevent this spread of pandemic, for example, by using your mask and also clear ventilation. However, there are still some disparities between local areas in terms of access towards vaccination. For example, in Indonesia, Java area is much more has much more access, broader access towards vaccination as compared to other remote areas. And from Dr. Ian Wilson's answer towards Ms. Rida's question, we can conclude that although local government responses are sometimes much more effective, for example, in Australia, there are local state responses, and in Indonesia, provincial responses are more effective instead of the national or federal government's response towards COVID-19. Yet there are still some politicians who are trying to undermine local responses because they are afraid of losing their image or their political agenda towards a more effective response from the local government. So next we have our second questioner, Ms. Diah Ayu Pitaloka. Ms. Diah, are you here? All right. You may ask your question.
Yeah, thank you, Pak Luthfi. I am Diah. Good afternoon, Bapak Ian Wilson and Bapak Beben. The first one I would like to ask for Bapak Ian Wilson. That was very interesting research about how populist anti-scientism as national pandemic response, since they saw pandemic as a threat for their regime. And it's also happened in not only in Indonesia, but also in United States, like you said before. And how about and how the oligarchy affect government response during the pandemic, lead to stronger role from local government. But today we've been in fried oil crisis. The fried oil crisis is been month in Indonesia, and yet the local government seem unable to provide solution, unlike when the pandemic happened 2 years before. But the condition is similar, I think, when handling the pandemic, where national government is not absent in policy, like they decide PPKM and then the consequence of that. And my question is, how you see this phenomena? Why the local government couldn't provide or filling this gap about oil crisis, Bapak Gadjah? It is, one recommendation is about how the pandemic giving more stronger role from local government. And when we see in oil crisis, why this not happen? For Pak Beben, I have a similar question actually with Ms. Rida, so I think it's all been answered. Thank you, Pak Luthfi and Pak Ian Wilson and Pak Beben.
Ms. Dia, so your question is towards Dr. Ian Wilson. Yes. Okay. Dr. Ian Wilson, did you catch Ms. Dia's question?
I think so. I think
Okay.
I've got something I can say. I think it was interesting that some have attempted, and by some I say some of the media commentary that I've certainly seen in English language press assessments of Indonesia's response. Some of it attempted to explain the Indonesian government's pretty lackluster response by looking at its status. Indonesia is a lower middle income country, and that arguing a classic state capacity argument that Indonesia is a middle income country. It doesn't have the effective state capacity to deal with this kind of unprecedented crisis. We've had pandemics before, but nothing of this scale. I'm a bit skeptical of that argument, because I think firstly, there are countries that are poorer than Indonesia in those broad economic terms who have actually responded pretty effectively, even in the region. And we can look at examples, such as Vietnam, particularly in the early stages. There's probably another argument there about democratic systems. There's been a separate argument that authoritarian governments have responded better, but I'm very suspicious of that argument just inherently. But I think firstly, the middle income argument doesn't hold weight. And also it's worth remembering that the Indonesian state has demonstrated its capacity to implement complex nationwide policies in the past. There's various examples that you can look at, even in the public health domain, when you look at birth control programs that have been rolled out in a complex levels across the country. The capacity is there. So that really, to me, poses the question, what is it about these particular circumstances that helps to explain it? It's not, I don't think, lack of state capacity, but I think, again, I'm returning to the same kind of core argument that I think this state capture by these particular interests really helps to explain the slow response, including denialism very early on, and that this is reflective of this broader, reflects the interests that control the state. Policy responses reflect interests. That's, as a political economist, to me, that's just a simple statement of fact. And in this response, that helps to explain it. I don't think underdevelopment explains it, because Indonesia is a middle-income country that's capable of delivering and has delivered effective nationwide policy in public health and in other areas in the past. But it was caught off guard. It hadn't invested. The central administration clearly saw the pandemic initially as a political problem rather than as a public health crisis. And I think its response reflected its intuitive reaction, which is, oh, this is a problem for us politically. It's going to undermine investment. It's going to undermine our infrastructural goals. And that reflects the orientation of the state. You know, you don't have to be a public health expert like Beben to conclude, well, that's the wrong response, because the right response to a public emergency is to mobilize the resources required. And again, this isn't unique to Indonesia. As I mentioned, the Trump administration was a classic case of a developed country fundamentally failing because of its capture by particular vested interests to respond appropriately. You know, even to a lesser extent, and it's a matter of degrees with these things. If I reflect on Western Australia as a state government, you know, Western Australia has one of the biggest the financial budget surpluses in the whole country. It has a massive surplus because we have the resource sector here. Our government is captured by mining and resource sector interests, as that's a key fact. What did they do with that money when we had 2 years where we've actually had no cases in 2 years because we were locked out from the rest of the country? Did they invest in public health? No, they didn't. They didn't invest any of that money in public health. Why? Because it reflected the interests of the economic sectors that drive our government, which is the mining sector. They were happy with closed borders because it facilitated the industry, but the government didn't invest in public health. I think that broader argument applies to the Indonesian national government case. We saw that in the political appointments that were made around the pandemic response that reflected particular interests. I mean, someone whose expertise is as a banker, as the health minister, you have to ask questions. I mean, I don't think it's a simple matter of, you know, your public health expert equals health minister. I don't think it's that simple, but you saw really a politicized appointments that reflected protecting the interests around that in this moment of crisis. And I think that explains what happened. I don't have a course of action to outline for you, I'm afraid. That would probably be another discussion. But that would be my response, is, you know, that's what we've seen. And that's been, you know, a feature of particularly populist governments, polarized political environments. And Indonesia's is very much, you know, that's an outcome of the past two presidential campaigns, a deeply polarized environment. I don't think that polarization is reflected amongst elites, because we've seen after the election's over, all the polarization disappears and they have shared interests, but it has been reflected in societal level tensions. And I think that's been that's been bad in terms of the outcomes when it comes to a public crisis such as we have now. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Ian, for your answer. Ms. Diah, do you have any comments to add?
Yeah, I think, yeah, thank you, Bapak Ian Wilson. Oligarchy is a big problem, maybe like what you said before.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, yeah. I think we need to work harder to make giving the benefit, especially for marginalized people. Thank you, Bapak Ian Wilson, for the answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Diah, for your question, and Dr. Ian Wilson for your answer. From Dr. Ian Wilson's answer, we can take an argument stating that, let's say, state capacity as an excuse for not responding quick enough towards the pandemic is not a valid response, because we've seen greater states, for example, great powers such as the United States, who are failing in responding quicker to the pandemic due to lack of political will. And there are still smaller nations with more effective response towards the pandemic because they have political will. And they are quick to embrace the fact that this pandemic is a public health issue, not a political one. And the next question is from Miss Ajeng Widya Prakasita. You may turn on your microphone.
Okay, thank you, Pak Luthfi. Can you hear my voice?
Miss Ajeng, your volume is not loud enough. Can you please raise the volume?
Okay, can you hear my voice?
Still not loud enough. Perhaps you may come closer to the microphone.
Okay, wait a minute. Maybe next person for asking first.
Okay. Well.
With my microphone.
Okay. While Miss Ajeng is trying to fix her microphone, we will come to the next question. Mr. Galip. Yes.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Pak Luthfi. Excuse me, can you hear my voice, Pak Luthfi?
Yes, it's clear enough.
Okay, I want to ask to Pak Beben Benyamin. We know that now there are new variant of COVID-19. These are BA4 and BA5 that detected in South Africa. So my question is, it will be more dangerous than another variant of COVID-19, and this pandemic will not transform to endemic. Thank you.
Dr. Beben, would you like to respond?
Thanks, Mas Galip, for the question. Yeah, so that's what the new discovery, isn't it, of the variant from again from the team of South African scientists who discovered the Omicron, I think the 3, 4, and 5. So it's I think it's still in the early stage of the emergence of the new variant, but as always, that all variant need to be monitored carefully, whether it can lead to more transmissible variant or more severe effect. I think the main key still at the moment, we know that the variant will keep coming, and then the surveillance of a team of genomic surveillance to identify the new variant is important to prepare the public health response, and then also to study kind of the full effect of that new variant. But as long as I understand at the moment, still all variant is still kind of can be better protected by vaccination. So although sometimes, like for example, Omicron can escape the immunity, which means that it will not protect people from transmitting to other, but it will protect them from severe disease and hospitalization, also a chance of dying. So vaccination is still the key, I think, in responding to this new variant. And then, as I mentioned in my presentation, that this will keep continue, and then the disease will be for us for foreseeable future, I think. So I think the correct response is combination between vaccination and all other public health strategy, and which kind of improve ventilation, probably masking in some setting, and then also better access for people to be able to get tested and isolate, and better support from the government for people to isolate and tested, for example, paid leave and all other important social measure. I think that's is that answering your question, Pak Galip?
Galip, do you have anything to reply?
Yes, thank you, Pak Beben Benyamin, for your answer. And I think that if there is a country to develop the factory over COVID-19, so I think it's too early, isn't it, Mr. Pak Beben?
sorry to I didn't get your question. Sorry, is it too early to
declare
transform
declare the early to declare over COVID-19 transform from pandemic to endemic, isn't it?
Okay, so I mean just the definition. So in public health, so there's a specific definition of epidemic, pandemic, and endemic. Okay, so an epidemic is that it's not only for the infectious disease, but it's mostly used for infectious disease. So it means that when the spread of disease is more than normal. Yeah, so it means that there is like increased cases. For example, there's epidemic of cholera, epidemic of measles, of epidemic of influenza, for example. So it means that there is an increasing case over a period of time in specific geographical location, which is more than usual. Okay, so the increase. And then when it happened across multiple countries across the globe, then it can be categorized as pandemic because it's happening everywhere. So that's why when WHO finally declared that COVID-19 is pandemic, so they need to make some kind of some specific definition why it is pandemic. But basically, pandemic is a larger version of epidemic. Okay, and endemic is basically it's when the disease is constant in the population. So it means that constant can be at the lower level constant, middle level constant, higher level constant. It can be endemic, although like case is like 1 million cases per day, but if it is constant like that, that's in endemic. Okay, so it means that it will be there forever, but it's not like in the trajectory of increasing or decreasing. So it means when it is constant, because it means that it is much easier to deal because we know that it's always something like that. So it's not like kind of suddenly increasing or whatever. So it's endemic. It's not that it is becoming over or easier or anything like that. It could be, but it could be with us that at the same rate. Yeah. So it's just like that. That's what the definition of endemic is in epidemiology and public health is. So endemic is one. I think the formal definition of endemic is once the reproductive number is 1. So it means that one case affecting one case affecting other. So yeah, so that's the kind of formal definition of endemic. So it means when disease stay the same for some period of time.
Okay, thank you very much, Pak Beben Benyamin.
Thank you very much, Professor Beben Benyamin, for your answer, and to Galip for your question. We can learn that despite the various growth of coronavirus, including the one which is currently still in early stage in South Africa, there are still several steps we can take to prevent the spread of pandemic, for example, through vaccination, and also wearing a mask and making sure that the ventilation is quite clean in your working space, and avoiding coming to crowded areas. And also thank you very much to Professor Beben for explaining to us the difference between endemic and also pandemic, because these terms are sometimes interchangeable because we are not experts in public health. And we come back to Ms. Ajeng. Have you already fixed the microphone?
Okay, hello.
Yes, we can hear you much clearer.
Okay, thank you for the time, Pak Luthfi. My name is Ajeng, and I would like to ask to Pak Beben and also Pak Ian. Before I go, I would like to say hello to Pak Ian. Hello, Pak Ian.
Hello.
Well, it's really interesting to listen to your explanation about the democratic decline in Indonesia. And I really agree with your explanation that right now in Indonesia, the democratic is experiencing the declinization. So you know that yesterday in Indonesia, we have a very big demonstration from the scholars that a lot of scholars in Indonesia rejected the discourse of 3 periods of Jokowi leadership. And I think it's happening because of the discourse that made by the national government itself through their representatives or even their executive person in the national government. So what is your opinion, Pak Ian, for this tragedy that already happened in Indonesia? So what is your opinion for the national government, and also maybe the suggestion or maybe the main reason why it is happening in Indonesia? Because they said that the 3 periods of Jokowi leadership is also because of the pandemic that happened in Indonesia. So when we held the election in 2024, it will be it's not safe for the people, for the society, if we held the election itself in 2024. Maybe that's the first question for Pak Ian. And also I have my question for Pak Beben Benjamin. You know, Pak Beben, that in Indonesia we have a unique characteristic of the society that maybe the culture and also the social factor is also happening and affecting people in Indonesia. It affects the response of the society about the vaccination is still negative, or not everyone still accepting the vaccination. And you know, the local government tried very hard to distribute it, and also to distribute the vaccination for the people in the local area, something like that. And I think it's quite unique for the public health also. They try to give the reward for people who want to do the vaccination by giving the rice, by giving the sugar, by giving the coffee and tea, and even by giving the fresh money for the society who want to do the vaccination. So what is your opinion about this phenomenon in Indonesia? And maybe you have another strategy for the public health practitioner in Indonesia to help the vaccination effective in Indonesia. I think, thank you. That's my question for Pak Ian and also Pak Beben.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ajeng, for your question. Dr. Ian, would you like to answer first?
Sure. Thanks for that very good question. It's been interesting to me to look through the course of the pandemic, the discourse that we've seen nationally around Pemilu and what more broadly reflects some of the views towards democracy in Indonesia. So back in late 2020, when we had the Pilkada in Indonesia, and I wrote a couple of things about this at the time. And of course, this is when the pandemic was really at one of its worst stages. You saw a discourse within the national government, and I remember this very clearly, like Pak Tito in particular, Menteri Dalam Negeri. And Pak Tito is interesting because he's been a figure who's been around for a long time. Of course, he was the head of the police for a significant time, and has been part of a significant discourse within political elites who've argued, and this goes back to the SBA administration, who've argued that democracy in Indonesia has already reached a point of keterlaluan, that there's an argument that democracy, in terms of electoral democracy, needs to be rolled back. And that's been a discourse that we've seen for some time. There's been pushes within various administrations to return to the new order practice of having the parliamentary appointment of Kepala Daerah, for example. Now, what's interesting is when it came to 2020, and that was a crucial Pilkada for the government, the national government, because there were key positions that they wanted their people to take control of, that, regional heads in Solo, in Medan, in other places. You had, mass organizations such as NU, and Pak Said Akil, the head of NU, argued very strongly at the time that they should push back the Pilkada for a few months because there was a public health crisis, that the resources, of course, elections are expensive to roll out in a big country like Indonesia. It would be a better use of resources to focus that on dealing with the pandemic, and the elections could wait for a couple of months, not throw them out, but wait for a couple of months. It's a very compelling argument. You had the government respond, the national government, saying we can't do that. It's crucial that democracy prevails, the elections go ahead. Pak Tito made a very clear argument, and I wrote about this, is why I remember it so clearly, that the Pilkada would give an important stimulus to regional economic growth in the midst of a pandemic-induced recession. Now, the same people who argued for the Pilkada to go ahead, despite the pandemic being at an utterly critical point, where there was underinvestment by the national government in its response, we have the same people who also argued for a third term for the president, which of course requires a constitutional amendment, a significant constitutional amendment. And arguably, no matter what you think of the current president, it's a significant shift away from the democratic trajectory that Indonesia has had. And you've also seen the pandemic used for the same kind of argument, but for a different political outcome. The argument that the pandemic has slowed down the objectives of the government. They haven't been able to realise their infrastructural and economic objectives. To me, as an outside observer, to use that as an argument for extending the term of a president is absolutely extraordinary. I mean, governments have to try and complete their programs within the electoral period. That's just the reality of democracies, whether you like it or not. So I think what you've seen is that in some respects, some of the anti-democratic forces within the national elites have revealed their hand. I mean, if you're a long-term observer of this, it's not a new revelation, but I think a lot more Indonesians have become, of course, with the controversy Tiga Periode, and we, of course, as you mentioned, we've seen these mass demonstrations by students who I think rightly appreciate that there's something significant at stake here, that this particular moment you're seeing interests within the national elites trying to push for a consolidation of power. You know, if you're arguing against popularly elected government, if you're arguing against transparent elections by postponing them or constitutionally amending the constitution so the president can stay in power for longer. And, you know, we've seen this in other countries in the world, including Russia under Putin, for example, and Putin is not a Democrat. I understand he's very popular in Indonesia, and I've written about this also. He's not a model for a democratic leader. So I think there's concerns. I hope this is responding adequately to your question. I think that we're seeing, you know, a real moment of crisis where anti-democratic forces are trying to consolidate their power, and they're using the pandemic to that effect, using it as an excuse. Firstly, that they haven't realised their objectives, and secondly, that's a reason for delaying elections. I mean, it becomes transparent when you look, and the Pilkada is a good example, where the national government argued very strongly that the elections must go ahead, and that was because it was utterly politically crucial to them to consolidate their regional power bases. When it comes to the national elections, now they're arguing the opposite, but using the same reason. I think that explains it pretty clearly, that we're seeing, you know, I'm trained as a social conflict theorist, so I think that democracy is never an end point. It's always a contestation between different interests, and that solid democracies always require a reaffirming of the core features of a democratic society. And I think, you know, Indonesia students have often been the moral voice of democracy and of social progress in the country. Flawed, because all social movements are flawed, and we saw that yesterday in some of the things that happened. But I think, you know, it's very important that there's a constant push to make sure, to keep government accountable and to make sure that they don't power grab at a moment of crisis. It's the same thing in Australia. We don't take, well, certainly many of us don't take transparent government for granted. It's something that we have to struggle for. And we have an election coming up, and I think a lot is at stake in Australia for the future orientation of our own democracy and the challenges of nepotism and corruption. And I think that's still very much the same in Indonesia. And it's unfortunate, but it's a fact of politics that some interests and elites have used the pandemic to try and consolidate power. I think that's very much the case in Indonesia. And I think it's a challenge to democracy. And I think it's great, as always in Indonesia, it's one of the things that I've always admired about political culture in Indonesia, that young people, that young intellectuals, students are young intellectuals, the thinkers have always been, the moral horse on the streets, speaking out. And I think we're seeing that again now. So I'll take this opportunity to show my appreciation for students in Indonesia as being so politically active and being so aware of what's at stake for their country's future. I think it's very important. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ian Wilson, for your answer. Ms. Ajeng, do you have some comments to reply?
Okay, thank you for the response, Pak Ian.
Thank you.
Okay, so next we move on to Professor Beben Benjamin. Would you like to answer Ms. Ajeng's question? Professor Beben, your microphone is not on yet.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Okay.
Thanks, Mbak Ajeng. So this is related to vaccine hesitancy, which is not special problem of Indonesia. So it is a worldwide problem of hesitancy. I think it's a problem where it is greater in some country compared to the other. I think it's I think what I can see, one of the main problem with it's distrust in authority or in government is one of the main source of vaccine hesitancy or anti-vaccine. And then the other one is probably quite a lot of widespread misinformation about the vaccination. I think it's also with I think related to more general problem about the fake news and all other things with the society in general, I think at the moment. So in Indonesia, I think it's not about anti-vaccination per se. I think what I can see, it's more about the vaccine hesitancy, and then also it could be probably due to the initial a problem with the rollout. So one of the things that I kind of observed in the initial rollout is that person who has comorbidity, they need to have a letter from a doctor to be able to be vaccinated. I think that's one. And then we know that the proportion of people who has comorbid, and then that's quite widespread information, and then also within the national guideline there, because I think I can see that the government is afraid that people who has comorbidity or other thing that they have side effect that probably like suddenly die when after vaccination, and then that will create a further hesitancy. I think so. They were kind of very strict on that people who need to be vaccinated need to be people who are healthy. I think that's one of the main problem that I can see in the initial rollout, why there's misinformation there. So in fact, people who has comorbidity, who has disease, that's the one who will benefit most from vaccination, because that's the one at high risk of severity or death by infection if they are not vaccinated. But that population, which is very large, we know that the people who has comorbidity are large percent of the population, they are not captured in early phase of vaccination, and then that information is still widely circulated. So I have a family member back home who kind of has a comorbidity of blood pressure, for example. She was refused vaccination several times because her blood pressure is like more than 140 or 150, which is probably quite normal for quite a lot of old people in that demographic. And then she was refused vaccination. But we know that she was the one who will benefit from vaccination because of high risk of mortality because of comorbidity. So I think that's one of the aspects that I find that the initial mistake. I think, I don't know now what the regulation again at the moment, but I think that's one of the specific Indonesian problem. I think that one, because I don't see any other country implemented the comorbidity check or health check before vaccination. I think one of the main criteria of vaccination is as long as you don't have very severe allergic reaction to material from vaccine, from previous vaccination, everyone can get vaccinated. It's only the allergic reaction. But in Indonesia, there's so many syarat atau condition before vaccination. I think that's one of the main problem. Not about hesitancy. There is some hesitancy as well, I think, but I don't think that's one of the main major problem. I think at the beginning. So I think to increase the participation, I think that's to correct that mistake. I think, and then to make the vaccination is widely applicable as much as possible, and then to make it easy for people to get vaccination. Especially now, I think encourage, like, I don't know about the booster policy now in Indonesia at the moment, but booster is important for grouping for future variant as well. I think that's I don't know about the campaign for booster at the moment in Indonesia, but I think that's probably one of the things that need to speed up and to increase the level of vaccination. And then also, I think, as we have discovered before, I think easy access and wide distribution to a regional area in the eastern part of Indonesia and some other remote area, I think that's probably important. So I think probably there will be some hesitancy, but I don't see that's the main problem. I think in Australia, I mean, it's very clear that there are like anti-vaccination movement, where there are kind of quite very strong group with anti-vaccination mandate, although very small minority, probably like 10% or so, but they are not hesitant. They are anti-vaccination, so it's slightly different, I think. But they are small minority. So in Indonesia, I think most of them are, I think, probably due to misinformation, and then also the early mistake in the early rollout, I think, about who should be vaccinated. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Beben, for your answer. Ms. Ajeng, would you like to reply?
No, I think it's enough. Thank you, Pak Beben, for the answer.
Okay, thank you very much to Ms. Ajeng for your question, and also to Dr. Ian Wilson and Professor Beben Benyamin for your answer. And still, there are several new points that has been discussed in the previous question. From Dr. Ian Wilson's answer, we learned that the issue of pandemic can be misused in both ways, either to strengthen democracy or also to decline democracy, such as delaying the election for the sake of fulfilling previous government's interests, which were not fulfilled, which were delayed due to the pandemic, or also sticking to the fact that there are limitations to leadership in democracy. For example, 2 terms of leadership, presidency is maximum as the rule in Indonesia. So we should not delay our election, although it takes a lot of money, for the sake of fulfilling the previous unfulfilled government targets, because the democracy must prevail in order to implement much better public health system. And from Professor Beben's answer, we can learn that there are 2 main problems which are happening in Indonesia in response towards the issue of vaccination. Number 1 is distrust towards the government in terms of why we should be vaccinated and such. And the second point is misinformation. For instance, Professor Beben have already explained that the people with some health conditions which are severe towards catching the disease of COVID-19 should be prioritized in getting the vaccination, because they will benefit the most from the vaccines. Next, we have Ms. Nisa Tasrif, who would like to ask a question.
Yeah, good afternoon. Can you hear my voice, actually?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, thank you so much. Good afternoon, Pak Wilson and Pak Beben Benyamin. I have a question for Pak Wilson. I'm sorry, for the first one, it's Pak Beben. Pak Beben, you previously say that what the differentiate the handling of COVID-19 in Australia and Indonesia was the well of immunity, the well of vaccination, and extraordinary COVID-19 handling program, including the Delta and the Delta one, I mean the new one. My concern is whether the vaccination is the only benchmark or is the best solution we have today. I mean, in dealing with this case and preventing the fatalities due to the pandemic, I mean, I don't try to doubting or criticize about the vaccination offered by the government or the health sector today, the science, but whether there is no other solution, I mean, other option to dealing with this disaster. The possibility, I mean, this is my first question for Pak Beben, and my second question is for Pak Wilson. Actually, you mentioned about democracy and political and so on, and I also want to bring up again about the case, about the term. Pak Wilson, I personally believe that everything can be politicized, including the current pandemic. And now that we can see that the health crisis, economic crisis, and the humanitarian crisis, we can see how some people try to declare in the political stage, declare about the 3 periode, like Mbak Ajeng said before. And this is a big news today in Indonesia, because there are some democracy and so on, and a lot of happens nowadays. But my question is, how you respond about the politician, about this is not about the crisis of economic, not only the crisis of economic, sorry, but this also the politicization of COVID-19 pandemic itself. This is the politicization of democracy. So this is not only the politicization of economic itself, but everything are politicizing nowadays. Thank you, Pak Wilson. I hope you get it. What my question? I'm sorry for. Yeah, thank you.
Dr. Ian, did you catch her question?
Sort of. Kalau bahasa Indonesia boleh juga, if it's easier. So to summarize, you were talking about the problems of the politicization of the pandemic. But what the questions exactly is what would you like me to respond to?
Yeah, I want to know your response about the politicization of a pandemic, the politicization of democracy in Indonesia that happens today. Because what I see that this is not only the politicization of democracy in itself, but it's also the politicization of the COVID-19, the politicization of the economy. So you can see that everything can be politicized nowadays. Thank you.
Yep. Okay, I understand. Saya duluan atau Pak Beben atau gimana?
So you can answer first, Pak Yan, so it's because it's fresh.
Okay,
otherwise,
yeah.
I can answer later. I've written the question.
Okay, sure. It's a vast question which I could spend hours responding to, but I'll try and keep it as brief as I can. If I'm going to be generous to government, and my default position, and I think as a political scientist, it's not our job to be generous to government. It's our job to be critical in a productive way. I think governments around the world have struggled to find the appropriate calibration of response to the outbreak. And I think we've seen that everywhere. It's not easy. There's public health measures, but of course, every measure has various impacts beyond that. There's economic ramifications. there's social ramifications. I mean, in Australia, parts of Australia, we had some of the longest lockdowns in the world. And there's a lot of reflection as to what, it probably saved a lot of lives. It also had a lot of other impacts on people's mental health, on people's careers, etc. So I think, to be generous, it's been very difficult for government to find the right calibration of responses. In terms of the politicization, well, I mean, as a political economist, to me, that's just part of the game, that whatever's going on will always be politicized, because politics is a contestation of interests. And we've seen that everywhere in the world, and particularly, we've hopefully provided, some observations about Indonesia's response, particularly at the national level, where I think it's been deeply politicized, insofar as we've seen interests of government try and negotiate the pandemic in ways that consolidate their interests, to profit from it, to use it as a space to push for anti-democratic reform. And we've also seen, and I think this is a general observation, I started my discussion today mentioning that in Australia, it's something that concerns me as a scholar of security issues, is the securitization of health. In Australia, we've seen the mobilization of the police and the military to deal with COVID policing. And that's, in some respects, a resource issue, because public health has been under-resourced in different ways. In Indonesia, it's not unusual to see the military at the forefront of an array of social issues, but I don't think it's a positive trend. I mean, it speaks to underinvestment in those areas, and it speaks to approaching public health and other crises as well through the lens of a militarized lens. And I don't think that's, I just want to highlight one thing, because your question, of course, I could speak for hours about it. I think that's a particular thing that's concerned me. In Australia, particularly in Australia, we're not accustomed to seeing the military being involved in non-military matters. And I think a lot of people, it makes us uneasy about a lot of things. In Indonesia, that's much more, the historical trajectories, the military has been very much embedded in social and political life. But I think it's important to keep an eye on that, and to not see that as an answer that means that they don't have to invest in public health or public health infrastructure, or health infrastructure more broadly. This idea of crisis management as a politicized crisis management response. I mean, I think that's something we've seen across the board. Again, one of my general observations before, populist administrations have seen this crisis as a threat to their own existential survival, and so have politicized their response. And that's included things like discrediting expert opinion. We've seen, I think, in Australia, a crisis of expertise. This is a general feature of populist administrations the world over, where governments have interests that are antithetical to expert opinion on key issues, including public health. And that's seen a deep politicization of this. I mean, in Australia, it's not a question of whether you're getting medical opinion, it's about what kind of medical opinion and who. We've seen chief medical officers in Australia, previously a very obscure position, being at the forefront of public policy. And I think in Indonesia, we've had equivalents where we've seen very politicized appointments to key positions that really reflect, I think it reflects the orientation of the state. You can observe and think, okay, well, these are the interests that are dominating. And that's something to keep in mind. Maybe that's my response. I think it was quite an open-ended question. So I think maybe I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Next, Professor Beben, would you like to answer?
Yeah.
This
So
question?
thanks, Mbak Nisa, for the question. I think just continue to point that was meant by Ian about the public health measure is it's kind of a trade-off. It's a cost-benefit analysis. It means that there is no single way to deal with a pandemic. So you're asking about is the vaccination is the only way to out the pandemic. the answer is no. I've shown you in the formula in my presentation before, is that to control the disease, there are 4 things. Like first is T, is to reduce the transmission. To reduce transmission is by, so it means that washing hand, masking. The second one is to reduce the contact, so it means that reduce the number of contact between people, so it means reduce the infection of other. D is to decrease the duration of the disease, so it means that when people being infected in very short period of time, it means that there is less time for people to infect other. So how to reduce that duration is by medication of treatment of, there are some medication for COVID-19. And the last one is reduce the number of people who are susceptible, which is S. How do we reduce the number of susceptible person is by vaccination. That's the one that we have at the moment. So it means when you are vaccinated, so it means you are not susceptible anymore to a virus. So there are a range of a tool to reduce the infection for them. Why vaccination is one of the most important at the moment? So I think in the early stage of pandemic, we don't have vaccination tool. Okay? We have only TCD. I think that's the tool that people have. So it means that a range of restriction, lockdown, and all other public health measures was conducted or was done because we don't have tool to reduce the number of people who are susceptible. But by vaccination, I think this is it has been shown in huge number of data that is very effective in reducing the death and hospitalization and severity, but it's not good in reducing the transmission. So that's why the idea of herd immunity is no longer exists now for COVID-19, because to be able to reach the herd immunity, the vaccination need to be able to protect from people from transmitting the disease to other. Okay, which is not the feature of current vaccine or COVID vaccine. So it's not been able to reduce the transmission, but it has been shown to be able to reduce the hospitalization significantly and reduce the death significantly, seeing from a lot of data. And then why is also vaccination is one of the most important tool, I think, in this, because any public health measure has costs. Yeah, so it's restriction, huge cost to the economy. Like I think, if I remember correctly, Pak Ian, that the cost of 1 week lockdown in Victoria, that's cost $1 billion. Yeah? So huge economic costs and huge social costs as well, about mental health and others. So it means that I think countries are no longer now consider lockdown and other restriction as a tool for public health intervention, because we have now tool which is medication and also vaccination, which is much cheaper overall. So it's, I think it's, and then much effective, and then it is the one that available at the moment, I think. So I think China is a different course at the moment. They're still using the other tool like TCD tool, but I think because they don't have good vaccination coverage and efficacy, I think, compared to the other country. I mean, I think that's one of the main reason why China is still using the other tool in addition to vaccination. But of course, that we shouldn't remove all the other tool as well, like, because that can reduce the infection in the first place. But by balancing between public health interest, cost to the economy, cost to the social life, then it seems that vaccination is one of the most significant tool that we have at the moment, I think, for reducing the infection.
Thank you very much to Professor Beben and Dr. Ian Wilson for your answer towards Ms. Nisa's question. On this question, we discussed about the importance of government response towards pandemics and future potential pandemics. From Dr. Ian Wilson's answer, we learned that it's still governments around the world are still trying to find the right way of responding towards pandemics, and including one of the ways is by securitizing this health issue. For instance, in Australia, there are policing in imposing lockdown, and in Indonesia, the military is also involved in imposing social issues and restrictions. Meanwhile, Professor Beben explained to us that besides from vaccination, the effective government response is initially by reducing transmission, and finally we have a more effective response by giving medication. Thank you very much to Ms. Nisa, and we have perhaps the last question from Mr. Jave Zulkarnain.
Okay, thank you. Do you hear my voice?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Luthfi. I think my question is to us, all right? Thank you for Mr. Beben and Mr. Ian Wilson for your presentation. My name is Jeff Zulkarnain. I'm from Sunan Ampel, Surabaya. And my question addressed to Mr. Beben. We know that COVID-19 has changed our behavior to more healthy, but COVID-19 also gives us negatively for our mentality and our economy. We have mentioned that vaccination has been decreasing death from COVID-19, but vaccination has not been delivered equally around the world. My question is, I just curious that is it possible that the function of vaccine can flow from the blood donation or through marital relation due to some people cannot get a vaccine for health reason? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Can you repeat again the question?
Yes.
Sorry,
yeah.
I kind of missed a bit.
Is it possible that the function of the vaccine can flow from the blood donation or through marital relation due to some people cannot get a vaccine for health reason?
Second,
married for marital relation, married for I think hubungan suami istri, like that.
Pernikahan.
Yes.
So
yes,
why pernikahan make the vaccination impossible?
Function, yes. Is it possible the function of vaccine flow from the marital relation, or because there is some people cannot get a vaccine because of reason?
So I think
I give example like the husband has vaccine, but the wife cannot get the vaccine because health reason, and they do the hubungan suami istri like that. It's possible to a function of vaccine flow to the blood of the from husband to wife like that without getting vaccine for the wife. Do you understand?
Oh, do you mean like it's only one needed to get vaccine and then it will transfer to the other one?
Yes, transfer, but not from vaccine.
No, it's not possible. So it's need to be individually injected by vaccination.
Okay, I just curious with
that.
Yeah.
It need to be individually vaccinated. Yeah.
So it cannot. It's not possible to.
No, it's not possible.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Beben, for your answer.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jave, for your question. We believe that that's the final question for this session. We are really sorry for those of you who have already typed down your question in the chat box, because we are running out of time, so we cannot answer those questions. But we have already written down those questions. We apologize for the inconvenience, and the next agenda is the certificate handover. We would like to present a certificate to both of our speakers today. Okay, can you see the certificate?
Yes.
Yes, okay, thank you. The first
Thanks very much.
certificate is presented to Dr. Ian Wilson for your wonderful presentation today. And our committee will send this certificate directly towards you. And the the second certificate is presented to Professor Beben, Benyamin, PhD, as our speaker today. And thank you very much for your insight and your wonderful presentation. Hopefully all of us can learn some additional knowledge from today's very lively discussion and also presentation from both of our speakers. Thank you very much. As the moderator, we highly appreciate your participation on this event. And after this, we will have the parallel session. Thank you very much for our speakers today, Dr. Ian Wilson and also Professor Beben Benyamin, PhD, for your time. And we hope that on future events, we could actually meet and also organize a similar event online and also offline after the pandemic is over. Next, I would like to hand over this screen towards our MC for the transition towards the parallel session.
Thank you very much, Pak Luthfi. Senang bertemu Pak Ian. Sampai ketemu lagi.
Terima kasih banyak.
Good discussion. Good discussion.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks very much. And great questions too.
Yeah, good question, great discussion. Thanks, Pak Ian, and thanks everyone. Terima kasih. Sampai ketemu.
Pak Ian, I'm sorry, before we end this session, please, for every participant on the camera for doing the photo together.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, everybody, please give your best expression. Okay. 1, 2, 3, cheers. Once again. 1, 2, 3. Maybe last chance. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. I will go to. Okay, makasih Pak Beben, Pak Ian. I will go to Mbak Umi as the master.
Sampai ketemu Pak Ian.
Ya, makasih ya Pak. Yuk.
Bye bye.
Yuk.
Beben Benyamin.
Okay, thank you. That was the plenary session of our day 1 with the invited speaker, Dr. Beben Benyamin from University of South Australia and Dr. Ian Wilson from Murdoch University, Australia, and our moderator, Mr. Luthfi Hidayatullah, M.Hub.Int. Let's give lively applause for the speakers, moderators, and for all of us. Okay, ladies and gentlemen. Next, let me take a photo together with all of the participants once more, yeah? Ready? From the first slide, 1, 2, 3. Second slide. 1, 2, 3. Next slide. 1, 2, 3. Next slide. 1, 2, 3. Next slide. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Thus, the series of plenary session for day 1 of SAICoPSS 2022 have ended. The organizing committee would like to thank you for your presence and apologize if there are any shortcomings and mistakes in the implementation of this event. After this, to all the participants, please go to our parallel session and see you on another time in another opportunity. Akhirul kalam, wallahul muwafiq ila aqwamit thoriq. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. For the parallel session, we will begin at 1 o'clock.
Oke, Bapak Ibu sekalian, sedikit informasi untuk parallel session. Insya Allah kita akan mulai pukul 13.00. Nanti akan ada breakout room yang sudah disediakan oleh panitia. Nanti Bapak Ibu bisa kembali lagi di Zoom ini pukul 13.00 ya. Nanti langsung aja masuk di breakout rooms-nya bertemu dengan moderator di kelas masing-masing. Baik, Bapak Ibu sekalian boleh isoman terlebih dahulu. Nanti kita akan kembali pukul 13 ya. Terima kasih.